Hierbij open ik deze academische setting, waarin Kimberley van der Heijden het academisch proefschrift getiteld The More the Better, How Variations in the Amount of Environmental Stimuli Impact Consumer Behavior and Decision Maker in het openbaar zal verdedigen. Can I request you now to give a summary of the content of your thesis?
Thank you very much. Dear members of the committee, dear colleagues, family and friends. Welcome to the presentation of my dissertation entitled The More the Better, How Variations in the Amount of Environmental Stimuli Impact Consumer Behavior and Decision Making. Before I continue with my presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to also mention that project 2 that I'm presenting today is in honor of Tom Mavis, a co-author for that paper who passed away shortly after publication. I will now give a short summary of my projects. So in our everyday environment, we are surrounded by a wealth of stimuli, and we're not only exposed to them once, but often we are exposed to them repeatedly. Think about, for example, your trip to the city center and you walk past by the Bischopsmolen. You smell their freshly baked fly and you really feel like consuming some of it. So generally, people respond positive upon initial exposure to such a stimulus. However, in an environment where stimuli are omnipresent, we are often not only exposed to a stimulus once, but repeatedly. And interestingly, stimuli seem to lose their effectiveness upon repeated exposure. So if you think about the food that you're consuming, the first bite always tastes much better than the second bite. Now, my thesis is about how an abundance, so having more, or scarcity, so having less of a certain stimulus, how this influences consumer responses. And specifically, for 2 projects, I look at this abundance of stimuli, so either an abundance of pictures or an abundance of light. And for one project, I look at the flip side, and I look at how scarcity of money influences financial decision making. I will now talk about each of the 3 projects separately. So the first stimulus is pictures of a vacation accommodation. So I think we all have to admit that we highly enjoy browsing through the many pictures that are available to us when we are booking our next vacation. So common intuition suggests that more is always better. And if we look at booking websites, we can actually see that they really try to cater those consumers' needs. Booking.com, for example, easily shows us 50 pictures per vacation accommodation. The question here actually is whether seeing so many pictures of a potential vacation accommodation, if this really makes consumers more likely to book a stay there. So what we did is we conducted 5 experiments where we either showed participants an extensive set of pictures of a vacation accommodation or a limited set. And important to mention is that in the extensive set, we did not show any more information than in the limited set. So in the extensive set, we only zoomed in on certain aspects that were already visible in the limited set. And after looking at the pictures, we asked participants how likely they were to book a stay at that resort. And what we consistently find is that those respondents that saw the extensive set, that they were actually less likely to book a stay at the resort as opposed to those who saw a limited set. Now, we argue that this is because people already are able to live the experience to such an extent that they feel satiated from it, so they're less likely to further engage in the complete experience. Now, where in this other experiment, we didn't show any more information in the extensive set. In the next experiment we conducted, we actually did show participants more information in the extensive picture set. And what we find there is that even when they receive more information, they are still less likely to book the resort as opposed to seeing pictures in the limited set. Now, a common scenario when you're looking on booking websites is that you look at multiple resorts. So we also conducted an experiment where we showed participants a resort that only had a limited set of pictures and a resort that had an extensive set of pictures. And what we find there is that, again, they are less likely to book the resort that has the extensive set of pictures. Now, all the previous experiments were run under the question, how inclined are you to book a stay at this resort? But we ran one experiment where we asked people to look at the pictures from a different perspective, so with a different mindset, asking them if they are interested in investing in this resort. So this is a very well-known concept in the United States. It's called the timeshare. So you basically buy a vacation accommodation where you go yourself a specific time of the year, and for the rest, you rent it out and you make money. So people who looked at either a limited set or an extensive set with the mindset of investing in it, actually we saw that it doesn't make a difference how many pictures you show them. So in conclusion, the key takeaway of this research is that more is not always better, and marketers as well as consumers themselves should be more cautious on how many pictures they would like to show to their audiences. The second project is about the stimulus of money. Now, financially constrained consumers are very well known to be short-sighted and present biased. So in case they get the decision to choose between a smaller, more immediate option or a larger, later option, they are more likely to go for the smaller, immediate option. So basically highlighting their present needs. However, there's a large stream of research that actually shows that financially constrained consumers are also concerned about their future needs. They are, for example, more inclined to think about opportunity costs, and they are also more inclined to invest in long-lived durables instead of short-lived experiences. So there actually seem to be two competing motivations going on in financially constrained consumers' head. So on the one hand, they are very concerned about the present, and on the other hand, they also have a concern about the future, so investing their scarce resources in a future-oriented manner. Now, the choice task that I just described to you, if we look at it, it doesn't really capture the second motivation, so people's concern about the future. And what you see in this choice task is actually that they need to make a trade-off. So they either need to consume everything now or everything in the future. And we actually say that this setup kind of reinforces financially constrained consumers' preoccupation with their immediate needs. So because they have to pay their rent and they need to have food, so they actually are very right in choosing the present option. But this is kind of steered by the nature of the choice task. So what we did is we run 3 experiments where we measured and manipulated financial constraint. And we had them do this choice task, which differed, like in total 3, which differed in terms of magnitude and delay. And we actually find that indeed financially constrained consumers are less likely to go for the later larger option as opposed to financially non-constrained consumers. Now, this is of course not very novel. And this is also not a contribution of a paper, but we also had them do a slightly different task where the setup was kind of similar, except for one important difference, in that we added a guaranteed immediate payout to both alternatives in the choice set. So this means irrespective of what they would choose, the present or the future amount, they would always get something in the present, meaning that they would be able to satisfy their most immediate needs, and they would be more able to more dispassionately make their decision. So it means in the future option, they would also get something in the present, and in the present option, we just added some extra amount to the reward that was already present. And what we actually find is that the decision maker of financially non-constrained consumers is more like the decision making of financially non-constrained consumers. So just by adding this guaranteed immediate payout, financially constrained consumers are showing decision making that's more in line with financially non-constrained consumers. So the key takeaway here is that financially, like the choice tasks that are used before are not really capturing true time preferences of financially constrained consumers. So we add more nuance to the findings done by previous research. The last project focuses on the stimulus of light. So maybe you want to immerse yourself in the experience of visiting a restaurant, and many of you might have visited a restaurant maybe during the weekend. So you walk in, there's a very nice music playing. You smell like the nice smell coming out of the kitchen from the food that they're preparing. And there's a very nice dim light, which creates a nice ambience. Now, light is often used to create a nice ambience in the restaurants. But another question that you could ask is, does it also influence the taste experience? So what we did is we conduct an experiment in a restaurant, and we either had people dining in a brightly lit restaurant or a dimly lit restaurant. And we told them, we have this amuse prepared, would you be interested in trying it, and to give us some feedback. So most people agreed, and they filled in this questionnaire, which asked quite some questions, and amongst others, they had to rate the taste intensity and the pleasantness of the taste. And what we find actually is that those dining in the brightly lit restaurant, that they rated the intensity of the food as more intense as opposed to those dining in the dimly lit restaurant. So the key takeaway of this research is that light is not just there to create a nice ambience, but it could also very much influence the taste experience. Now, to conclude, abundance and scarcity, they matter, and they influence consumer responses depending on the context and depending on the stimulus. So we saw that an abundance of pictures actually makes people less inclined to book a stay at a resort. So people are becoming decreasingly sensitive to varying amounts of pictures. If we look at the stimulus of money, we see that people are not really sensitive to varying amounts of money, but they are more sensitive to getting something versus getting nothing. If we look at light, we saw that brighter light, so an abundance of light, actually makes the taste experience to be perceived as more intense. So people are becoming increasingly sensitive to varying amounts of light. Now, to answer the question of the title of my dissertation, The More the Better, I'm going to answer with a question that I received as a student many times when I was studying here. And the answer is, it depends. This was my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you for the presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Lemming, who holds a chair in marketing at Maastricht University.
So, dear candidate, dear Kimberley, congratulations with your dissertation. Very easy to read, a clean presentation of some very nice results. So, congratulations, and I also congratulate your supervisors Professor Gaukens and Dr. Vestjens. Yeah, of course, I have a question on chapter, not on chapter 2, but I have a question, right? And this question is related to chapter 2. And I was wondering, and I would like to you to challenge to think of the pattern of actually these satiation, right? So you present the respondents with a number of pictures, visuals, on the one hand, and a larger number of visuals, and you draw some conclusions. So I would be curious, what pattern would you find if you would have investigated a little bit of a broader range of stimuli? For instance, providing no pictures at all. How would that compare to the situation that you investigated? But also, for instance, the number of pictures that you present to the respondents. So if you would only present one and then present 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, would you think that there would be a sort of an optimum there, a maximum? Because you, in the end, you are predicting a decreasing effect. So, and it suggests some linearity there, but could you please comment on that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. So your question is basically like, is there a pattern in the kind of how this would look like in terms of number of pictures related to satiation? I tested 4 versus 12 pictures. The reasoning behind that was that we found literature that shows that 4 pictures is what people can process in a normal amount. So that's why we chose 4. And then on the other hand, we chose 12. And that was based on how we zoomed in on the certain aspects. So in the 4 picture conditions, we show a different scenario in every picture. And the question you raise, I think, is a very fair one, because we also thought about this question. So how does it look like if you have no picture? How does it look like if you have 1 picture, which is also very sometimes the case? And is there a sort of an optimum amount of pictures? So I don't have the exact answer of what the exact amount of pictures would be, but the data that we have, we actually saw that if we show 1 picture, that people are still very much inclined to go, because it's also a little bit the whet the appetite effect that I described in my introduction. So people are really like warmed up to what's coming for them. And showing them 4 pictures is still in line with this. So their inclination to actually book the stay is similar to 1 pictures versus 4, because I think 4 is still quite limited, and it's also therefore still whetting the appetite. What we do find is that indeed at 12 pictures, it decreases. So somewhere between 4 versus 12, there is a drop in, if you want to call it, with respect to the satiation in terms of the enjoyment of the pictures. So somewhere in between that number, 4 versus 12, there should be satiation. If I look at other literature that's there's always been varying amounts of pictures used, also in satiation literature. So sometimes they use only very limited numbers, so maybe 3 or 8, and sometimes they use 15. If I look at the basic principles of satiation, it's about the repetitiveness. So if people perceive it to be repetitive, they are more likely to experience satiation. So I would say, as I also saw in my results, because I zoom in the 12 picture condition, but even if I don't zoom in and show them more information, it still declines. So it's also not just about the content being repetitive, but maybe also more about the whole process of it being repetitive. Because if you look at how I presented the stimuli to my participants, they were 1 by 1. So that's why it might be that they perceived it to be more repetitive. instead of me showing it to them just all on the same page. So it might have highlighted the repetitiveness of the pictures, and that's why probably after 4, so somewhere between 4 and 12, there was a huge drop in enjoyment.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
The discussion will be continued by Professor Sveldens, Chair of Marketing at Erasmus University Rotterdam.
Dear Kimberley, dear candidate, first off, allow me to congratulate you on your thesis and express my happiness of being here today. I met you for the first time many years ago at the EMAC Doctoral Consortium, where you already presented the contents of Chapter 2 to me. I'm very happy to see what you've done since. Most notably, your Chapter 3 is, I think, the crowning piece of your thesis. Was published in like one of the most highly regarded journals in science. As a matter of, and I think that almost any doctoral candidate in the world would be envious of you graduating with a paper published like that. So that's wonderful. Your the chapter about light also has been published, but the first one still hasn't been published, which is exactly what I warned you about at that doctoral consortium so many years ago. Not because it's not interesting, I find it super interesting. And as you know, my first doctoral student studied a topic that was very much alike, and he also never got it published. The reason is that this research is extremely hard to do with the experimental controls that are necessary to satisfy those extremely picky reviewers at the very best journals in our field. Your research too, I find it fascinating, like I told you then, but there are a number of things that, of course, those reviewers will be falling off. I would like to discuss one of those things with you here, and that is the issue of the confound by presentation duration. So the argument you make is about people see 4 images or 12 images, and more images satiate people more. The problem is, in all of those studies, people are also forced to watch for a longer time when they see more stimuli, which can lead to a confound with feelings of annoyment or ennui or boringness, etc. People have to take that study, so they have to watch those things for longer. That might also make them more negative about the resort in that condition, for example. And I would like you to contemplate a little bit on the problems that this could cause for the results, to what extent the moderators you have rule out or don't rule out those concerns, and more specifically, what could be done experimentally to control for that issue. There are various possible approaches, and the most interesting one that I actually would really like to hear some contemplation on is, what if people would be allowed to self-pace the presentation time of those stimuli? Like in real life, when people visit one of those websites, you're never forced to keep watching an image for longer than you want to, right? So if you would offer people the opportunity to browse through 4 images versus 8 images at their own speed, would you still find these results? Would you find other results? Have you thought about that? Have you maybe even investigated?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. The concern you raise about the duration and how this potentially could have influenced the results, this is also indeed something we heard from reviewers, so this is not very new to us. But I think it's an interesting discussion, because we also had that with the team and we had to make some trade-offs. And I would like to kind of share some thoughts on that. So what we did was actually very controlled, right? We timed the presentations, and we also did that with the reasoning, in the sense that research shows that people need a certain amount of time to process something, and this is usually 5 to 10 seconds. So we thought, okay, let's time them, and we see that indeed 4 pictures requires less time than 12, but yeah, if it's so experimentally controlled, then we have no option that there's a difference in time. Other option could have been, we're going to show the 4 pictures in the exact same time as the 12 pictures, but that would mean some people have to look at the same picture for a very long time, that could also create boredom. We tested actually for boredom in the conditions. We run a small experiment on it, and we don't find an effect. So I'm not really sure if it's boredom that's really causing it. Another alternative that we could indeed have done is, so maybe to rule out alternative explanation with respect to the moderators. So we thought with the experiment where we show them the two resorts, where they basically all have the same time duration, they just either see resort A for a longer time or resort B for a longer time, we still find our effect there. And for us, that was a good reason to say, okay, this time component, which was heavily criticized by reviewers, this is now equal for everyone, and we still find the effect. So for us, that was enough reason to kind of continue with the project. We, of course, thought about the self-pacing, which I think is the most realistic option. It's also the option I would have preferred. But the biggest problem is the respondents, who are not highly motivated. So we run quite some studies on MTurk, and I think you're also very well familiar with that audience. So people, MTurk is basically where people fill out surveys for some amount of money, and they, yeah, you could question what their real interest is, like learning something about research or just earning money. Yeah, I think most of the population on MTurk is interested in making some money. So yeah, they don't want to spend a lot of time filling out surveys. So they might click through it very fast, which would actually mean they're not observing any of the pictures, they're just going through it. Yeah, I didn't find that the ideal setting, so that's why I was like, okay, let's make it more controlled. We also run experiments in the lab here in Maastricht University, and even in the aula. But even there, like, people are just gonna click through it because, I mean, still they want to be nice and helping you, but they don't really understand research. And sometimes if you hear some comments from them, like, they think it's nothing that they did, but it's like, yeah, it has a big influence on our results. So that was actually the trade-off that we made while we had it paced. Alternatively, we could pace it with 10 seconds to still have it a bit controlled. Alternatively, you could also just present them the pictures, maybe all at once, because that's also an option that you see on booking websites. Maybe that's not really. So the thing is, with respect to the repetitiveness, and I think because you watch them one by one, and on booking.com, you also watch them one by one. So the repetitiveness is very clear, and that's why it causes satiation. So if you show them all in once, you might actually, they don't really perceive this repetitiveness. So satiation might be less of an issue. So this would be something very interesting to research for future research. And this could be something that booking.com could improve. If I look at other research that measured satiation, also with pictures, but not in our context, we see that there was one study by Redden that showed people a picture of a beach for 15 seconds each, no, 20 seconds each, 15 times, and they see the exact same content. So if I compare my research to that, I think we were very nice to our respondents in showing them at least some kind of variety. But the point I'm trying to make is that the research that is there on satiation, and Redden is the authority in the field of satiation, that, yeah, I think we kind of stick to what was there, and to make it a bit more controlled in the environment. But yeah, more like field study would be interesting.
Thank you. The discussion now will be opened by one of our online opponents. So like often is the case nowadays, some people cannot attend physically and are seen online. The opponent invited to the floor now is Professor Vermeer, who is a professor of marketing at Ghent University.
Thank you, dear Kimberley, dear candidates. First of all, I also want to congratulate you with this interesting dissertation. I really enjoyed reading it. It's well written, structured, clear, it's concise, and a particularly strong point of this dissertation is the practical relevance of the empirical findings. So first, a big congratulations to you. So my question is about the third paper or the fourth chapter. So in this paper, you investigate whether ambient illuminance influences taste intensity. So it's interestingly because it's practical relevant. And nowadays, it seems like a lot of restaurants are evolving towards these more bright illuminated colors and decors. When I look at my own city in Ghent, a lot of new sustainable, healthy restaurants choose for this light decors. And this could, if this has an influence on how people perceive taste, this could, of course, have got many other effects or many, it's an interesting topic. This is what I would like to say. Now, I would want to dig deeper into two possible, more cognitive processes that underlie the effects that you find. So in your discussion, you mentioned somewhere the neuroscientific framework, a theory of magnitude, which assumes a correlation between magnitudes in different domains. So bigger and brighter in one domain should correlate with bigger and brighter in another domain. So in your case, you say higher light intensity would also translate into higher taste intensity. But I was wondering whether this higher light intensity could also translate to a non-perceptual domain, a rather cognitive domain, so that it maybe translates into a more extreme response style. Maybe higher intensity of lighting could bring people into a state of outspokenness, a state of acquiescence, so that they agree more with everything that they see. So when you ask them afterwards about their taste intensity, that they also indicate higher scores. So this is a first possible explanation maybe. And a second one that could be going on is maybe when you have these intense lights, maybe that makes you see more details. So more details of the foods that you're going to eat could mean that you maybe perceive that the cooks used a more varied taste palette. So they used more ingredients or something. And so people would think that this would also translate into a more intense taste perception or sensation. So could you comment on these two possible underlying processes?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I'd like to ask for one clarification. You mentioned a theory called the state of, and then I couldn't hear it.
A theory of magnitudes. So you mentioned that in your discussion.
Yeah, but then you said an alternative explanation could be, and I kind of missed what you mentioned there.
So it could be a more cognitive one. So I was talking about the fact that people could feel more outspoken or acquiescent, so they are more agreeing. This is what I was going for. So a more cognitive way of processing, in the sense that you agree more with everything. So not this is what I aimed for. Is this clear?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree that there are many possible theories, and we just highlighted some of them in the discussion. But of course, like there are many possibilities. I've read a bit more on this, and I'm actually starting to be more and more convinced that it's this alertness that's very important. So bright light would trigger more alertness in people. And this would kind of fit with your theory of being people being more outspoken in bright light conditions. So I think the fact that they are more alert might also maybe make them feel like more or being more outspoken, because if you look at dim light, that you see that people are more mindlessly making a decision. So I think this outspokenness of being, I think that would be a possible interesting scenario to research in the current context. And your second theory is about more details on food that you would see in a bright light condition. So you would basically see more different food palettes that you kind of can taste in your mouth. There is actually a research that cited us. So that was published after our publication. And they say that people are experiencing actually more intense taste if the light is dim. And this is because people have this compensatory system. So if you don't experience it in one sense, you will experience it in the other sense. And they also say that our research, so the research that we conducted, is that we found this intensity because people do not need to compensate. So they don't have this compensatory mechanism. However, while I was reading that research, I think their results might not be completely consistent with ours, in the sense that we were very clear on how we manipulated the light. So we said the dim light condition is 13 lumen and the bright light condition is 300 lumen. How the researchers in the follow-up research actually conducted their experiment was with putting sunglasses on people's face, which I found very interesting to trigger dim light. And the experiment afterwards that they conducted, they just mentioned they either put the light in the room on 0% or on 100%. So they were not very clear on the amount of lumen. And I'm also not very sure how bright the light was there. So in terms of me believing that alertness is actually quite important in this bright light condition, I would say I'm not sure if this really was the case in this other research, because if you put on sunglasses, I would say it's a completely different experience. So to answer your question, it does trigger more different taste palettes. There has been some research conducted on that, but I'm not really sure how that would fit to ours. So I would say conduct the experiment indeed again, but also with properly registering the amount of lumen. In our own research, we also tested for, does the visual appeal actually change? So we did a small follow-up experiment, and we basically see that that was not the case. So it was not the visual appearance of the food that triggered our effect, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting.
The discussion now will be continued by Dr. Gijskens, Associate Professor of Marketing at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, dear Kimberley, I also want to congratulate you with this piece of work. I really enjoyed reading it as it investigates intriguing research questions whom we as consumers can relate to. The studies are cleverly designed and use a variety of methods and perspectives. Your findings are very inspiring with important implications for practitioners. You can be proud of the result. Now, thinking back of our first encounter in which you, as a motivated master thesis student, explained to me that you wanted to write your thesis on the ego depletion effect, I was sort of expecting you to do a PhD on ego depletion, or at least on self-control. But although there is no explicit focus on self-control, each chapter or each paper in your dissertation relates to this main issue of self-control, wanting the short-term pleasure versus reaching long-term goals. What I would like you to do is to reflect shortly on this issue of self-control, or the implications of your findings for self-control for each chapter specifically. For chapter 2, so the first paper, there you explicitly state in the intro, given that on social media we are often exposed to pictures of stimuli that cannot directly be consumed, that is, vacations of tropical destinations and McDonald's food and beverages, this finding has great implications for marketeers of these kind of products and experience. So my question is then, To what extent can you apply or would you expect the same findings for exposure to stimuli of, for example, McDonald's, as investigated in this chapter? And how could this affect consumers' ability to control themselves? In relating to chapter 3, are the findings of chapter 3 applicable in other self-control situations? Specifically, would an immediate payoff, for example, a snack, help consumers in sticking to their diet? So in chapter 3, you investigate everything related to money. The question is thus whether this would also hold for food-related decisions. And in the last paper, in chapter 4, you find that bright ambient light increases the perceived taste intensity. This has important implications for retailers and restaurants, but what are the takeaways for consumers? Specifically, if a person who wants to restrict food intake approaches you for some helpful advice, what advice would you draw from your findings?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Yes, I very vividly remember our first encounter, and I did do research something on healthy decision making, which was the effect of round and non-round prices. And I think I will explain that later, that this also comes a little bit back in my answer to you. So my first chapter with the pictures of vacation accommodations, yeah, people are actually tempted all the time by seeing those pictures, especially on social media. And I think that works as long as it's limited exposure. So that might be in terms of time, also might be in terms of quantity. But at some point, it probably will be too much, because we're repeatedly exposed to it. Also, if you look on Facebook, on your feed, you sometimes see the same thing coming back again and again. And satiation is also about memory. So how it's stored in your memory, is it very recent? Then you satiate also faster. So if you more vividly remember it. So depending on when you saw the last stimuli of something, and I don't have an answer on what the optimum number of days is or hours before people forget about it. The answer would be it depends on how well they recall the most frequent encounter of it. And it's also stimulus specific. So it might be that if they see pictures of resort A, that they might not be satiated of pictures of another resort. So I would say self-control here is related to the fact that, yeah, they are tempted all the time by the exposure, but it depends on the amount of pictures and the duration. Going to the second project, so for financially constrained consumers, yeah, we gave them a guaranteed immediate payout to satisfy their most immediate needs, because we believe that this is so present in their mind that this influences their decision making. And I think we showed quite some evidence for that being the case. This means that if you would relate it to the food context, giving people something small to eat to satisfy maybe their most immediate cravings, and then they could choose to either eat everything or they consume something at a later point in time. And there's actually a paper on this. So this paper actually shows that how we describe our effects. So if you kind of fulfill this immediate need to some extent, that people are also kind of satisfied or satiated, and they are more likely to make decisions that are more in line with their long-term health. So this means trading off immediate, something more immediate, which might be less of a unhealthy option, or something more long-term, which might be a more healthy option. If you give them something to satisfy their immediate needs, they will also be able to make decisions more in line with the long-term consequences. And the last chapter is about light. In essence, light does many things. It creates a nice ambience, and it apparently, as we showed, it taste intensity perceptions. As I already mentioned, I'm quite convinced that this alertness is quite important in this whole process. And why do I think that? There's a paper published, I don't remember the year, but it's by Biswas, and they actually tested the effect of light intensity on healthy decision making. And they find that indeed bright light triggers alertness, dim light leads to more mindless decision making, and bright light leads also therefore to more healthy decision making. And here comes a bit the theory of my master thesis in practice, because the more alertness means that they are more cognitively making their decisions. So they are more looking at the more cognitive attributes also of the food options. In the dim light conditions, they are more mindless, so they are more relying on their affective system. So they're more making decisions with their feelings. And they are just more looking at the affective components of a food option. So that's why in the dim light condition, they are more likely to go for the unhealthy options, because they consider these affective responses. So I would say bright light leads to more self-control in this last case.
The discussion will be continued by Dr. Jiao, Associate Professor of Finance at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, dear Kimberley, I also want to first join my colleagues and probably everyone here to congratulate you on such excellent thesis. And it's impressive that the two of the chapters already are published, and especially chapter 3 is published in a very prestigious journal in our field. And my question is regarding chapter 3. Although it's already published, I hope to stimulate your thoughts on maybe some follow-up studies. And my question is regarding the design of your experiment, and particularly that can potentially influence how we interpret the result. So if I may, could I please ask you to turn to page 51 and look at table 1 in that chapter? Because if you compare your finding in the new task with the classic task, your finding is that more financially constrained people are choosing option B, which involves future payments, compared with the classic choice task, where more financially constrained people choose option A, which is about immediate payment, right? And your interpretation is that if you give these financially constrained people a guaranteed immediate amount of payment, that triggers their choice of this future-oriented payment, right? So I wonder whether this particular design of this new task can allow for some alternative explanations or confounds. For instance, the presentation of option B, if you compare it in the new task with the classic task, it seems that it's easier for people to identify that this option B dominates option A, because they can receive an amount that's at least equal to the immediate amount in this future option, and then additionally receive something else. And the other potential confound is that in option B, it always involves payment in more than one time point. But option A, there's only one payment involved. So that can also trigger a feeling of preference for a spread of payments instead of receiving payments only at one time point. So I want you to think about these issues and maybe put them in more perspective in this broader literature about the relationship between poverty and behavioral biases, particularly, for instance, by prominent authors like Sandy Muller-Nason. And they find that poverty sometimes are correlated with more bias. But here, what you seem to be suggesting is that these financially constrained people are less present biased. But I wonder, is it because these particular design choices actually conceal some of the underlying other biases? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. So the question is basically on alternative explanations for our results. And first you hint at the option B dominating option A, and in the second suggestion you say B is basically spreading the consumption. And then there's also the research that says that poverty correlates with biases. Maybe I want to start with that because I would not fully agree with that. I think financially constrained consumers are also human beings with biases, but there is quite some research actually that shows that they are less susceptible to these biases. For example, they are less likely to, or they're more likely to identify hidden surcharges, which is something you might see in a hotel, you know, that they charge you for something extra. Those people are really keen on seeing that. And it's because they have this mindset of being deprived. And this kind of mindset triggers you to see everything that's related to that. So, for example, if you're hungry, you will see a lot of food items around you. If you're thirsty, you are seeing a lot of drinks, basically. And financially constrained consumers have that the same with money-related issues. Also, if they are taking a taxi drive, they are more likely to already know exactly how much it's going to cost. So financially constrained consumers are actually less price sensitive than financially non-constrained consumers. So that's why I would say, like, I'm not fully agreeing with these biases, because I think in certain aspects those people are much more clever than financially non-constrained consumers. But that doesn't mean that there might be alternative explanations for my research. So if I start with the spreading the payment, of course, this is something that's very much appreciated by financially constrained consumers, because it means they can have something now as well as something in the future. And the problem with the other option is that they only consume something at one period in time. Now, there is some research that says that consumers like to spread consumption. And that's also why they, as I previously mentioned in my presentation, why they are more likely to go for long-lived durables instead of short-lived experiences. So they rather buy a TV that they can watch like for years every day than to go to a theme park, for example. So in that sense, I would say my results fit with this previous research. And if I look at this option B being more dominant, that was mainly because there's a higher amount. So this is with classical intertemporal choice tasks, that's always the case, that the future option is larger than the smaller, more immediate option. And of course, the future option is the better option in the long term because they get more money. They just need to wait for it. And I think that's why it's interesting to have financially constrained consumers do this choice task, because if you look at this other research that's been conducted previously with this classical intertemporal choice task, what we also mentioned in our paper is that they might not really measure true time preferences. And that means actually that for financially constrained consumers, their consumption utility is the same to these time preferences, because money for them is not fungible. Like they cannot consume it at some other point in time, and also food, they can only eat it now and they cannot eat it at another point in time. For financially non-constrained consumers, this is not the case, because they have access to credit, so they can basically also invest their resources in another way. So that's why for financially non-constrained consumers, this is not the ideal task that's used previously. And we think actually by introducing this guaranteed immediate payout, that this dominance is also a bit less. So there's this paper by Urminski and Kivitz. It's about the mere token effect. So yeah, they basically have a task that's similar to ours. So they also give something smaller and something later, but they don't find an effect of financial constraint. And I think there's a very reasonable explanation for this. So what they do is they give their immediate payout in 3 days. And they give the other payout in a week, and the later payout they give in 2 weeks. So it's not very immediate what they're giving, but this immediacy is very important for financially constrained consumers, and that's kind of what frames their decision making. So what you basically say in their task is that being financially constrained doesn't make a difference in respect to being financially non-constrained if they engage in this task by Urminski and Kivitz. But with us, the immediate payout is really immediate, and because this, it's a very visceral factor, very visceral response. And since with us it's immediate, we do find an effect of financially constrained and non-constrained. And the more strong the contrasts are, the stronger is the immediate payout effect. So I think we kind of managed to disentangle the process a bit, and also the underlying reasoning by just using a task, but we didn't test for any mediation. So there's something that could be done in future research, which I think would be very interesting to really find out the underlying process. But for us, we believe that it's really the immediacy that needs to be fulfilled. So they really need to pay rent, so they need something. And if this something is fulfilled, then also their mind, because they have only limited bandwidth, because they are constrained, and this is very present in their heads. So if this state is taken care of.
Can I ask you to briefly summarize your answer, because then we move to the next opponent.
So if this immediate need is taken care of, they have more mental bandwidth, and that's why they can make decisions that are more in line with their long-term needs.
Thank you. The discussion again moves online and will be continued by Dr. De Boer, who is an assistant professor of marketing at Maastricht University.
Dear Kimberley, also, I would like to join the other people with congratulating you for this thesis. So I thought it was very interesting written and very well written also. It was very clear to read. And I think it's also very nice how you did a lot of, or collected a lot of data through experimental studies and field studies and so on over a set of different topics. So I also wanted to congratulate you on doing that successfully. So I have one question with regard to chapter 3, where you show that financially constrained consumers are more likely to choose the later rewards when they get an immediate payoff. And so I think this is an incredible, interesting finding that you have. But then the question is, especially from a practical perspective, how big does this immediate reward need to be actually? Because I think from a purely practical perspective, you want to be the reward as small as possible, of course, in order to get people to invest in their financial future. And I also wonder if even the financial incentive or the reward even needs to be financially, or if there are other ways to kind of create this rewarding experience in financial constrained consumers to get them to save.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. It's basically about how big does the reward need to be? And I think that's a very fair question. We haven't investigated that, so we did test different types of rewards. But I think there's another interesting potential future study that could be conducted, and that could be to see indeed how much does the reward need to be to trigger this behavior, because you can imagine maybe a person that has a need of 100 euros. If he gets a reward of 50, is that still going to be sufficient to trigger this decision making more in long-term needs? And the same goes also the other way, right? If you give them 150, they have a need of 100. Do we still trigger the same decision making? Well, I believe that the bigger reward is always going to be good because it fulfills.
Kunt u antwoord heel kort afmaken?
So I think the bigger reward will trigger the decision making that we described in our paper. For the smaller reward, I would be interested in conducting a study to see if it's really liquidity constraint or if it's just, okay, I get something, so it's already fine if I just get a small reward. So that would be future research for me.
Kimberley van der Heijden, de gelegenheid voor het verdedigen van uw proefschrift is voorbij. De promotiecommissie zal zich nu voor beraad terugtrekken. Ik verzoek u en uw gezelschap onze terugkomst en de uitslag van dit beraad in deze zaal af te wachten. De zitting is verdaagd.
Wait, but I have to check the thing. Do we put it down?
De zitting is heropend. Kimberley van der Heijden. De commissie hier aanwezig heeft zich beraden over de kwaliteit van uw proefschrift en de wijze waarop u dat proefschrift heeft verdedigd. Op grond van haar positief oordeel en gelet op de examens die u vroeger heeft afgelegd, heeft zij besloten u het gevraagde doctoraat toe te kennen. De hoogleraar professor Gaukens, uw promotor, is gemachtigd u op de gebruikelijke wijze met deze waardigheid te bekleden. Het woord is aan professor Gaukens. Daarna volgt de laudatio door Dr. Vesjes.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible? By the authority vested in us by law, and in the conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Kimberley van der Heijden, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidenced by this, I now present you with a degree of certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dear Kimberley, congratulations. We are so proud of you presenting this nice collection of essays today. Job well done. When preparing this laudatio, I was thinking of all the things I know about you. By the way, what I apparently do not know about you is that you once launched the wrong study and collected data for that one. Thanks for the info, Gita. One thing that I do know for sure is that you love amusement parks. You even take some days off each year to visit one, and these off days are sacred, even if they coincide with resubmission deadlines. In some sense, I think the PhD process may have felt like a kind of roller coaster ride for you. I guess we could all agree. Your PhD ride had deep SPSS downs. It went via tricky theoretical obstacles, over challenging and sometimes very bizarre review tracks, which were full of author mud, analysis dirt, and academic writing dust. It also involved travel agency traps, cooking ambushes, and pandemic outbreaks. Just if they were ingeniously installed there for you by a set of critical reviewers and of course by your supervisors. But you also braved this death, right? It was not easy. It costed blood, sweat, and tears. You know what I'm talking about. But you found your way in all of this. And I'm confident that this ride taught you also a lot about yourself, about the things you're very good in, but also the things you are not that good in. And one of the things in which you excel is asking help for others, from others for this latter category of things. This talent is truly admirable, and it will certainly help you in the rest of your life. You constantly look, and very importantly, are open and receptive for expertise that complements that of your own. And that makes you, as a very sociable academic, an expert in virtually every domain. Evidently, people should also be willing to lend you support, but that is easy for you. You get things done. This is because people like you. You are an active builder of ambience. You are very sociable and easy accessible. At international conferences, where you, by the way, excellently presented your work, you were immediately accepted as one of the team. Tom Mavis from New York Stern, who sadly passed away during your trajectory, and David Gall from the University of Illinois, immediately agreed upon teaming up with you. This is so important. It is often underestimated, this teamwork. I personally believe that standing on each other's shoulders is necessary to create true scientific and thus also societal impact. The fact that a warm atmosphere is a top priority for you was also evident when you started your job search. When we first asked you where you wanted to go, you said, I don't really care as long as it has a warm climate. And so it happened. You first applied at a school in Mallorca, afterwards in Barcelona, and finally you ended up at SAD. What is in the name? The importance that you put on intrapersonal warmth was also clear in the couple of weeks after you moved to your own apartment. You missed your parents and needed some time to find your way without them. That was a tough period, but even without being directly at your side, it was very clear to me and Caroline that they greatly supported you in all your endeavors. Kimberley, it is clear that you need people around you to feel good. From all PhD students, you are the only one who came to the office so often. Actually, you were always present and always smiling. Your office even looked like a home. Even in the middle of the pandemic, you still refused to work from home, only when you were really forced to do so. And on those days, you had an open Skype connection with Gita. Never alone. Kimberley, you have grown tremendously, and we are so pleased with the book you published here today. It was an honor having you as my first PhD student. You, as a graduated scientist, created knowledge about human decision-making. Thanks for that. We miss you in the department. We miss you in the Lief en Leed group, but also elsewhere. And we will cherish the Kimberley Award during our future department trips. Congratulations also on behalf of Caroline, to you and to your family. And now it's time to celebrate. Congratulations. Thank you.
Dr. van der Heijden, namens de Universiteit Maastricht feliciteren wij u met uw behaalde doctorstitel. Hiermee is de sessie gesloten.
Ja.